On April 18, 1943, 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters flew a 100-mile round trip through total radio silence over the Solomon Islands, and their target was one man, an admiral who 2 years earlier had told his own government that the war they were about to start was one they could not win. Isoroku Yamamoto designed the attack on Pearl Harbor. That same admiral also warned, repeatedly and on the record, that attacking the United States would lead Japan to ruin. Those two facts sit next to each other without canceling each other out, and that contradiction is the whole story. What follows is the account of a man who built the weapon, argued against pulling the trigger, lost that argument, pulled the trigger anyway, and then spent the next 19 months watching his own prediction land with brutal accuracy. Almost everything people think they know about Yamamoto starts with a lie, and that's the place to begin clearing the ground. The line everyone quotes, the one about waking a sleeping giant and filling him with a terrible resolve, never appears in a single letter, diary, or document from the war. A screenwriter invented it for the 1970 film Tora. Hollywood recycled it in Pearl Harbor in 2001, and Midway brought it back again in 2019. Yamamoto never even kept a diary, which guts the most common version of the myth. The one claiming the line came from his own private journal. The producers of Tora insisted a letter containing that passage existed somewhere, yet nobody ever produced it. And William Safire, writing his political dictionary, found no printed evidence the quote was ever real. None of that means the sentiment was wrong. It means Yamamoto said something sharper, something more damning and far more interesting, and he said it more than once, in writing, in documents that have actually survived. Born Isoroku Takano on April 4, 1884, in Nagaoka, a city tucked into Niigata Prefecture in northwestern Japan, the future admiral came from a family the Meiji Restoration had quietly pushed toward the margins. His father, Sadayoshi Takano, had once held samurai status in the old Nagaoka domain, but when the new government abolished the samurai class, that status stopped paying the bills, and the family settled into what records politely call genteel poverty. Isoroku means 56, his father's age the day his son was born, an oddity strange enough that it defined the man's identity for the rest of his life. By 1916, at 32 years old, Isoroku Takano had been formally adopted into the Yamamoto family, another former Nagaoka samurai house with no male heir to carry its name forward. Adoptions like that were a recognized way of preserving a family line in Meiji Japan, and Yamamoto carried that borrowed name for the next 27 years. What actually shaped his read on America wasn't intelligence briefings or staff reports, it was direct, on-the-ground experience. Between 1919 and 1921, Yamamoto studied at Harvard as a special student focused on economics and the petroleum industry, and from there he toured oil fields across the United States and Mexico, not as a tourist taking in the sights, but as a man studying industrial muscle up close. America was already the dominant industrial power on Earth by the time he arrived, and Yamamoto didn't just read about that fact in a report somewhere. He drove past the refineries and saw the infrastructure with his own eyes. He understood, because he had watched it firsthand, what it meant for one country to produce more than 60% of the world's petroleum output. The Imperial Japanese Navy then posted him to Washington as naval attaché between 1926 and 1928, handing him years of structured exposure to American political and military life. He backed that exposure up with poker. Yamamoto gambled well, skilled enough at bridge and cards that he liked to say if he could hold 5,000 Japanese ideographs in his head, holding 52 playing cards was nothing. He sat down regularly with American naval officers and civilian contacts, treating the card table less like recreation and more like a research tool, watching how Americans made decisions under pressure, when they bluffed, when they folded, how they handled a bad hand. Edmund Morris, writing for Harvard Magazine, recorded that Yamamoto's old classmates remembered him as a hard worker who was never a grind, restlessly curious, the kind of man who hitchhiked across America on his poker winnings just to see more of it. By the time war with the United States became a live question in Tokyo, Yamamoto was the one Japanese officer best positioned to say what that war would actually cost, and his answer wasn't the one his government wanted to hear. To understand why Japan went to war with America, and why a man who opposed that war ended up designing its opening blow, you have to understand the resource math Japan was working with in 1941. This wasn't a rogue nation chasing ideology for its own sake. This was an industrialized country boxed into a structural trap with no clean way out. And that situation has a modern parallel worth sitting with for a second. A tech company that burns through its cash runway with a half-finished product faces the exact same logic. Every option left on the table is bad. Waiting only makes things worse. And eventually the organization takes the catastrophic risk rather than die slowly and quietly. Scale that up to a nation-state, and the stakes change from a failed company to a war that killed millions. Japan's army had been fighting in China since 1931, and after 1937 that fight became a full-scale war that refused to end, refused to resolve, and kept consuming resources Japan didn't have an endless supply of. Watching all this with rising alarm, the United States started applying real economic pressure at the exact moment Japan's position was already stretched thin. The numbers tell the story bluntly. 74% of Japan's scrap iron came from the United States in 1938. 93% of its copper came from American suppliers the following year. And oil, the fuel that powered every ship, every aircraft, every tank in an industrial war, came overwhelmingly from the same source. Then, on July 26, 1941, Washington froze Japanese assets, and an oil embargo followed close behind. That single move cost Japan access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil almost overnight. 43 million barrels sat in Japan's reserve at that point, and the Navy itself calculated that supply wouldn't last 2 years, with wartime consumption rates cutting that timeline roughly in half. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. No oil from the Dutch East Indies meant Japan's military, the army bogged down in China, and a navy expected to hold the entire Pacific would grind to a halt within 2 years, maybe 18 months. Taking those oil fields meant neutralizing American naval power in the Pacific first, specifically the fleet sitting at Pearl Harbor, since that fleet could otherwise sever Japan's supply lines at will. And neutralizing that fleet without tipping off Washington beforehand meant a preemptive strike unlike anything any navy had ever attempted. That was the trap, and it wasn't insane reasoning. It was strategic logic pushed to its breaking point under extreme pressure. The real mistakes had come earlier: the decision to invade China in the first place, the push south, the assumption that America would sit quietly and watch it happen. By 1941, those earlier mistakes had compounded into 3 remaining choices, none of them good. Cave to American demands and pull out of China, an outcome the Army treated as a national humiliation it would not accept, or accept a slow economic strangulation, or roll the dice on a war Japan's own military planners privately doubted they could win. Yamamoto had been sounding the alarm on exactly this outcome for years before it arrived. In September of 1940, Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono summoned him for a meeting, prompted by the looming signature on the Tripartite Pact, the alliance with Germany and Italy that would put Japan on a collision course with the United States. Yamamoto didn't soften anything. If I am told that we must fight, then for the first 6 months or a year, I will show you a great spectacle of destruction. However, beyond 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence. Now that the Tripartite Pact is in place, I implore you to do everything possible to avoid war with the United States. That statement survives in its original Japanese, recorded in Kono's own memoir, published after his death, and what makes it remarkable is everything packed into one breath: an honest military forecast, a concrete timeline, and a direct plea for diplomacy. Yamamoto wasn't being falsely modest. He was doing math. America made more than 60% of the world's oil. Japan's entire reserve could fuel a war for maybe 18 months. And a long war was never going to be a military question. It was always going to be an arithmetic problem, one he had solved years earlier driving past oil derricks in another country. The answer hadn't changed since then. His opposition to the tripartite pact was never quiet or private. As Navy Vice Minister from 1936 to 1939, he spoke against the alliance publicly, and that earned him hate mail and death threats from Japanese nationalists who read his caution as either weakness or outright betrayal. The Navy, aware that one of its most capable officers now faced real physical danger for holding a defensible strategic position, gave him command of the combined fleet in August of 1939, a move that handed him genuine authority while also conveniently putting him to sea, out of reach of the people in Tokyo who wanted him dead. The irony barely needs pointing out. The man most qualified to stop the war ended up in the one job that would force him to start it. In January of 1941, Yamamoto wrote to Ryuichi Sasakawa, a member of Japan's Diet, and the letter reads nothing like a boast, more like a warning dressed up as a question. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. A photograph of that original letter still exists in a Japanese archive, and here's what most people miss about it. Japanese nationalist groups quietly deleted that final sentence, the one questioning whether the politicians actually had the stomach for what they were starting, and circulated an edited version that made Yamamoto sound like he was promising to conquer Washington outright. That doctored letter then got picked up by propagandists on both sides of the Pacific. The version used to paint Yamamoto as a fanatic was a forgery built through omission. The real letter was a strategist asking, in plain language, whether his own government had thought any of this through. It hadn't, as everything that followed would prove. So here's the paradox sitting at the center of Yamamoto's entire career, the question that makes this story worth telling at all. If he genuinely believed war with America meant catastrophe, and he put that belief in writing to the Prime Minister himself, why did he turn around and design the Pearl Harbor attack? The answer isn't simple, but it holds together, and it says something real about how institutional pressure, professional duty, and personal conviction collide at the top levels of military command. The standard version of this story paints Yamamoto as either a reluctant pawn of the militarists or a brilliant strategist who just happened to disagree politically, and neither version captures what actually happened. The more accurate picture is a man who saw the war coming no matter what he said, concluded that if it was happening regardless, Japan needed to fight it as effectively as humanly possible, and then built the most audacious naval operation in history out of something close to grim professionalism. The attitude of a man who thinks the whole plan is a mistake, but figures if everyone's doing it anyway, you might as well do it with every advantage you can manufacture. Pearl Harbor, in Yamamoto's own conception, was never really an act of aggression at its core. It was a gamble built on deterrence. The reasoning went like this. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor stood as the single biggest threat to Japan's supply lines once the push south for the Dutch East Indies began, and that fleet could not be allowed to roam free while the conquest was underway. Standard Japanese naval doctrine, something called Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle strategy, called for waiting until the American fleet sailed west into Japanese home waters and crushing it there with the help of land-based air power. Yamamoto threw that doctrine out entirely. Waiting only gave America time to mobilize, reinforce, and hit back harder. The only way to buy real time was to wreck the Pacific Fleet right at the start, before it could move at all. What he actually wanted wasn't total war. It was a blow so devastating, so demoralizing, that America would look at the cost of rebuilding the fleet and fighting across the entire Pacific and decide negotiation made more sense than revenge. That was the gamble, not conquering America outright, not a war that ended with troops in Washington, just a shock big enough to end things at a conference table instead. The idea itself was his, and the Naval General Staff under Chief Osemi Nagano fought it at first, preferring the older doctrine, skeptical that concentrating 6 fleet carriers in one operation made sense, skeptical the logistics would hold together, skeptical surprise could even be maintained across that distance. Yamamoto didn't try to win the argument through persuasion. He threatened to resign, along with his entire combined fleet staff, if the plan didn't get approved, a tactic he'd already used once and would use again before the war was over. Nagano, staring down the loss of his most capable fleet commander on the literal eve of war, gave in. If he has that much confidence, Nagano reportedly said, it is better to let Yamamoto go ahead. Commander Minoru Jinda handled the tactical side, a naval aviation specialist who'd already concluded that carrier aircraft, not battleships, were going to decide the next war at sea, and he called the plan difficult but not impossible. Jinda then picked his old Naval Academy classmate, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, to lead the actual air strike, an experienced pilot and one of the sharpest air group commanders the Navy had. Through 1941, the two of them trained pilots, developed shallow water torpedo tactics specifically for Pearl Harbor's harbor depth, and worked out the exact timing for both attack waves. When the task force left Hido-Kapo Bay in the Kuriil Islands on November 26, 1941, it represented the heaviest concentration of naval air power ever assembled in human history. 6 fleet carriers sailed together, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, carrying roughly 414 aircraft between them. 2 fast battleships, the Hai and Kirishima, rode alongside, plus the heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, the light cruiser Abikuma, 9 destroyers, a string of oilers, and 23 submarines, some of them carrying 2-man midget submarines meant to slip into Pearl Harbor independently. The signal that sent them forward, transmitted December 2nd, read simply, "Climb Mount Itaka 1208." They crossed the North Pacific in total radio silence. No naval force in history had ever gathered this much firepower for a single strike, and Yamamoto had just committed his entire carrier force, the most valuable and irreplaceable thing he owned, to one single throw of the dice. He wasn't even aboard the strike force when it sailed. Yamamoto stayed behind on his flagship, the battleship Nagato, sitting in Japanese home waters, waiting for reports to come in from across the ocean. The attack itself, on the morning of December 7, 1941, achieved complete tactical surprise. The first wave of 183 aircraft hit at 7:53 a.m. local time, with a second wave of 170 following close behind. When it was over, 2,403 Americans were dead, 1,178 more wounded, 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and another 159 damaged. Along Battleship Row, the Arizona and Oklahoma were destroyed outright, the West Virginia and California went down, and the Nevada, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Maryland all took damage. Japan lost 29 aircraft, 64 men, and 5 midget submarines that day, and not a single ship. Judged purely on tactics, it was devastating. Judged on strategy, it failed its very first test, and it failed within hours. None of the 3 American carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, happened to be sitting at Pearl Harbor that morning. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was off on a similar ferry run to Midway, and the Saratoga sat in dry dock up in Puget Sound for maintenance. Pure scheduling luck meant the targets that actually mattered most weren't even in port. The battleships, the symbols Yamamoto had specifically prioritized for their psychological punch on the American public, those were sitting right there burning. The carriers, the weapons that would actually decide the rest of the war, weren't touched at all. There's a useful comparison here to how modern cyber operations sometimes misfire against critical infrastructure. You knock out the visible, networked nodes while the redundant backup systems happen to be offline somewhere else, and what you've actually done is force a rebuild onto newer, more resilient architecture. Pearl Harbor wrecked the old, visible hardware. The carriers, which represented the real future of naval warfare, sailed away untouched and became the backbone of everything America threw back at Japan. A second failure hides inside that tactical success, one that gets discussed far less but probably mattered more in the long run. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, running the strike force, called off a planned third wave once the first 2 had finished their work And what survived that decision wasn't the battleships. Those were already burning. It was the fuel storage farm at Pearl Harbor, the repair shops, the dry docks, the machine facilities, and the submarine base. None of that was symbolic. All of it was the actual infrastructure that let a navy keep fighting. Burning battleships made headlines and crushed morale, but intact fuel tanks and repair yards meant the Pacific Fleet could be back in operation within months rather than years. Nagumo had real reasons for stopping when he did. His dive and torpedo bombers had already taken losses across the two waves. Nobody knew where the American carriers actually were, and staying in the area risked a reversal if those carriers showed up while his own fleet still sat exposed. Anti-aircraft fire was getting heavier by the minute, fuel was running low on some of the destroyers, and night carrier recovery in 1941 was unreliable enough to risk losing aircraft just landing them. Jinda and Fukuda both said afterward they'd wanted to keep pressing the attack, though Jinda later denied ever formally requesting a third wave, and the record doesn't show a unified push that Nagumo simply overruled. What's clear is that the call not to press further belonged to Nagumo alone, that Yamamoto later said out loud he regretted it, and that everything left standing at Pearl Harbor was back in operation within hours. Word of the attack's success didn't land the way Yamamoto's own staff expected. While his officers celebrated, Yamamoto spent December 8th sunk in what multiple sources, including Hiroyuki Agawa's definitive Japanese biography of the man, describe as apparent depression. That tracks with something he wrote a month later to take Tora Ogata, editor-in-chief of the Asahi Shimbun, on January 9, 1942. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. Read that twice, because it lays out the entire strategic situation in one breath. There's no celebration in those words, no boasting. Just a precise prediction that the attack had triggered the exact response he'd feared all along, that the war wasn't beginning on Japan's terms after all, it was beginning on America's, with a furious, unified population and the largest industrial economy on the planet converting to war production overnight. What that industrial conversion looked like in practice is staggering on its own. By 1944, America built more aircraft in a single year than Japan had manufactured across the entire war, from 1939 through 1945. More than half of all industrial output on Earth was happening inside American borders by the war's end. Japanese steel production peaked somewhere between 6 and 9 million tons a year through the late 30s and early 40s, and what followed wasn't a competition between two industrial powers, it was a manufacturing gap that could only resolve one way. Yamamoto had known all this since he drove through American oil country back in 1921, and he'd already said as much to Kono in 1940. Seen in that light, the attack he designed wasn't a contradiction of everything he believed. It was the most aggressive possible version of the only strategy that gave Japan any shot at escaping the outcome he already knew was coming. Hit America hard enough, fast enough, that negotiation looked smarter than revenge. The gamble fell apart in the first 12 hours, the moment it became clear the carriers weren't in port. What followed wasn't a war so much as a reckoning that had already been written before the first bomb fell. For months and 11 days after Pearl Harbor, on April 18, 1942, 16B, 25 bombers lifted off the carrier Hornet and hit Tokyo. The Doolittle raid barely scratched the city physically, small fires, secondary targets, nothing that mattered militarily. But psychologically, the damage went deep, and nowhere deeper than inside Yamamoto's own head. The raid proved the home islands, the Emperor's home, the symbolic core of the nation, were exposed to American carrier power, and Yamamoto had spent his entire career arguing carrier aviation would decide the next war at sea. Now he was watching that argument prove itself against him. Even though there wasn't much damage, he said afterward, it's a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down. That raid gave Yamamoto the leverage he needed to push his next operation through the Naval General Staff. Japan needed to push its defensive perimeter further out into the Central Pacific to keep something like Doolittle from happening again, and Midway Atoll, sitting about 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, was the logical target. Take Midway, and American carriers couldn't get anywhere near the home islands undetected. Better still, the operation would finally drag the American carriers out into the open, forcing them to defend the atoll, and when they showed up, Yamamoto's combined fleet would be waiting to finish what Pearl Harbor hadn't. He used the resignation threat one more time to push it through. But here's where the entire plan was compromised before a single ship left port, and Yamamoto had no idea. American codebreakers had cracked JN 25B, the primary operational cipher the Imperial Japanese Navy used to coordinate its fleets. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had spent months grinding away at that cipher, and by spring of 1942, they were reading enough Japanese operational traffic to follow what was happening in real time. When Yamamoto's Midway plans started moving through Navy channels, Rockefort's people picked them up immediately. They confirmed the target code name, F, through a deliberately simple trick, having the Midway garrison broadcast in plain language that its water desalination equipment had broken down. Japanese signals traffic shortly after referenced AF, running short on fresh water, and that was confirmation enough. The target was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew where Yamamoto was headed, when he'd get there, and roughly what he was bringing with him. Nimitz positioned Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher in ambush northeast of Midway, exactly where Yamamoto's scattered forces wouldn't think to look. And scattered is the right word for what Yamamoto's plan actually was. By any operational standard, it was needlessly complicated, spread across multiple task groups separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. A diversionary force sent up toward the Aleutian Islands, Nagumo's carrier strike group, invasion transports, a separate support force, and Yamamoto's own main body riding the super battleship Yamato alongside the Nagato and Mutsu, positioned hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's carriers, too far away to help, too far away to receive the same intelligence. Tokyo was feeding Nagumo directly, and too far away to matter when everything fell apart. Yamamoto kept Yamato under strict radio silence throughout, which meant Nagumo got no warning about rising American submarine activity, no updated intelligence suggesting the carriers might be closer than expected. The largest naval gun platform ever built sat in the middle of the Pacific, functioning as a floating headquarters that had voluntarily cut itself off from the battle it was supposed to be commanding. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Nagumo's first wave hit Midway. The island's defenses held firm, and American aircraft scrambled out from the atoll without much success. Then, at roughly 10:25 that morning, dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown found a gap in Japanese air cover and hit 3 of Nagumo's 4 carriers within minutes of each other. The Akagi, Yamamoto's original flagship and the symbol of everything Japanese carrier doctrine had built, took fatal damage. The Kaga went up in flames. The Soryu was finished entirely. In under 6 minutes, Japan's entire offensive naval capacity collapsed. The Hiryu survived that first strike and managed 2 counterattacks that mortally wounded the Yorktown before Enterprise dive bombers found her too and finished the job. The Soryu went down the night of June 4th. The Kaga sank that same evening. The Akagi followed at dawn on June 5th, and the Hiryu sank later that same day. The Yorktown, crippled by Hiryu's counterstrikes, held on for a few more days before the Japanese submarine I-168 finished her off on June 7th, taking the destroyer Hammond down with her. For fleet carriers, gone, along with their veteran air crews, in 3 days. The ships themselves were one kind of loss, but the trained pilots represented something Japan couldn't replace nearly as fast. Years of training walked out the door with those crews, and Japan's shipyards could build new hulls faster than its flight schools could turn out experienced aviators. Midway didn't just cost Japan ships. It cost Japan the human expertise that made those ships dangerous in the first place. There's a real parallel here in how modern high-performance organizations actually function, whether you're talking about surgical teams, special operations units, or carrier flight decks. The irreplaceable asset is almost never the equipment, it's the trained team running it. America lost the Yorktown at Midway, but the crew survived, transferred to other ships, and took their knowledge with them. Japan lost 4 carriers and their veteran air groups together, and that knowledge simply vanished. America spent the rest of the war building Essex-class carriers faster than Japan could match, while Japan spent that same stretch trying to rebuild carrier aviation with green pilots and a shrinking fleet. Midway is the moment the industrial gap that already existed turned into an operational catastrophe. The battle ended almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, which lines up with terrifying precision against what Yamamoto had told Kono back in 1940, that he could run wild for 6 months to a year. The timeline held. The consequence was catastrophic. Historian Jonathan Parshall, co-author of Shattered Sword, the most rigorous English-language breakdown of Midway from the Japanese side, didn't go easy on Yamamoto's role, describing a needlessly complex operational scheme that dispersed his forces in the face of a still dangerous foe and directly led to the disaster there. Yamamoto had correctly diagnosed the decisive battle problem back at Pearl Harbor, then recreated that same problem at Midway on a much larger scale, scattering exactly the forces he needed and parking himself too far away to fix anything once it went wrong. Command responsibility for that fell on Yamamoto, and in keeping with Japanese military culture at the time, nobody was publicly blamed. Japan's public didn't learn about the losses for months. Yamamoto didn't resign after Midway, and he didn't retire either. He stayed on as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, running the increasingly grim defensive campaigns across the Solomons, including the brutal grind for Guadalcanal that dragged on from August 1942 through February 1943. He remained a figure of enormous prestige inside the Navy and an even bigger symbol for civilian morale back home. And the Japanese leadership needed him visible, needed him active, because the alternative was letting the public catch on to how badly the strategic situation had deteriorated. What he understood privately by then was that the trajectory he'd warned about back in 1940 had become unstoppable. Japan simply couldn't build the ships, the planes, or the trained crews fast enough to reverse course. Oil from the southern resource area kept flowing, technically, but American submarines were hunting the tankers carrying it, and the defensive perimeter kept shrinking month by month. In the spring of 1943, Yamamoto launched Operation I, an aerial offensive across the Solomons meant to use land-based aircraft to make up for everything lost at Midway. The results disappointed him. American air power in the region was stronger, better supplied, and reinforcing at a pace Japan had no way of matching. On April 13, 1943, the Navy transmitted a detailed itinerary for Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour of frontline bases near Bougainville in the northern Solomons, sent through the JN-25D cipher. American radio intercept stations picked it up almost immediately. The decoded message laid it all out. Yamamoto would leave Rabaul at 6 o'clock a.m. On April 18th, aboard a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the type Allied forces called the Betty, escorted by 6 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, landing at Balale Airfield around 8 o'clock a.m., before continuing on by Minesweeper and aircraft to Shortland Island. Exact departure times, exact flight routes, exact arrivals, all of it sitting in American hands. American intelligence now held, in precise detail, the complete travel schedule of Japan's most important naval commander. The only question left was what to do with that information. The decision to kill Yamamoto moved through the American chain of command almost instantly. That decoded intercept traveled from the Pacific Fleet's intelligence staff to Admiral Nimitz, then to Navy Secretary Frank Knox, and reportedly all the way to the top of the American government, where the response came back in 2 words: get Yamamoto. No written presidential order has ever surfaced, but Knox's signature appears on the operational directive sent to the squadron, and its language must at all costs reach and destroy President Attache's extreme importance to mission, leaves little doubt about where the authorization originated. Nimitz brought in Admiral William Halsey, running South Pacific operations, and approved the mission on April 17, 1943, sending it down through Admiral Mark Mitcher to Major John W. Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron out of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Before signing off, Nimitz checked with Edwin Layton, his chief intelligence officer, and one of the few Americans who actually knew Yamamoto personally. And Layton told him no other Japanese admiral matched his stature, his experience, his innovative thinking, or his charisma. If Admiral Yamamoto is shot down, Layton said, it will be the greatest individual blow we can deal the enemy. The mission got the green light. The P-38G Lightning was the only fighter in the entire Pacific theater with the legs for the job, capable of the roughly 100-mile round trip the mission demanded, and the pilots would need to fly a wide, looping route just to stay clear of Japanese radar along the Solomons coastline. Each P-38G carried 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all clustered in the nose for maximum punch at close range. The plan called for a low-level approach skimming the ocean surface, total radio silence, and navigation by dead reckoning alone. No landmarks out over open water, no beacons to follow, just a compass, a watch, and Major Mitchell's experience guiding 18 aircraft to one exact point in the ocean at one exact moment. Those 18 P-38s lifted off from Henderson Field around 7:25 that morning, and 2 aircraft dropped out almost immediately with mechanical trouble, costing the killer flight 2 of its intended 4 pilots before the formation had even cleared the runway. Mitchell navigated by dead reckoning for nearly 2 hours over featureless water, and at 9:34 a.m., roughly a minute ahead of schedule, the formation hit its interception point right as Yamamoto's transport descended into view with its 6-0 escort exactly on time. The killer flight peeled off, Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber going after the bombers while Lieutenants Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine covered against the Zeros, and what happened in the next 60 seconds has stayed contested for more than 80 years. Both Lanfear and Barber claimed they'd shot down the lead bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto, and for decades the credit got split evenly between them with no resolution. Later investigation, Air Force Historical Research Agency reviews, forensic reconstruction of the flight paths, testimony from the Japanese side, has shifted that consensus firmly toward Barber. Kenji Yanagiya, the Japanese Zero pilot flying escort that day, gave testimony that lines up with Barber's flight path, not Lanfear's, and Daniel Hallman, who sat on the 1985 Air Force review panel, said decades later that credit belonged to Barber and not Lanfear. Once the Air Force officially sided with Barber, Lanfear lost the ace status that Kill had given him. Yamamoto's bomber went down in the Bougainville jungle. A Japanese search party found him the next day, still upright in his seat, thrown clear of the wreckage, sword still clutched in hand. A Japanese naval doctor who examined the body attributed death to gunshot wounds in the jaw and shoulder, though that medical report was later altered, according to Agawa, on orders from above, since Japanese authorities couldn't let the exact circumstances of his death get out too clearly. The second bomber, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, went down at sea near Moila Point, and Agaki survived along with 2 others. Japan's military kept Yamamoto's death secret for about a month, managing the announcement carefully to avoid crushing public morale outright. When the news finally broke, a state funeral followed on June 5, 1943, and Yamamoto was promoted posthumously to Marshal Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and awarded the Order of the Chrysanthemum, First Class. His ashes made the trip home aboard the battleship Musashi, his last flagship, and he was buried in 2 places, his hometown of Nagaoka and Tama Cemetery in Tokyo. Whether killing Yamamoto actually mattered strategically is one of the more interesting open questions in Pacific War history, and it echoes a debate that still runs through counterterrorism theory today: the value of decapitation strikes, removing a single leader at real operational cost, and sometimes real strategic risk. The case for it. Japan lost its most capable and most psychologically irreplaceable naval commander at a moment when the fight in the Solomons was still genuinely up for grabs. The case against it. By April 1943, Japan had already lost Midway, lost Guadalcanal, and lost most of its strategic initiative, and no Admiral, Yamamoto included, was reversing that with what remained on hand. From that angle, America didn't remove the engine driving Japan's naval power, so much as it removed one of the few officers who actually understood how the war was likely to end and might eventually have pushed for a negotiated settlement sooner rather than later. Whether that would have shortened the war or just complicated it further is something nobody can answer with certainty. A few things about Yamamoto and the Pacific War get treated as settled fact when they're actually still argued over seriously, and they're worth addressing head-on. First is the question of whether America had advance warning of Pearl Harbor. That argument, tied most closely to Robert Stinnett's 1999 book Day of Deceit, claims the American government knew the attack was coming and let it happen anyway to drag the country into war. Professional cryptologic historians have gone through that claim extensively, and the consensus is that it doesn't hold up. Commander Dwayne Whitlock, a Navy cryptologist who was actually working Japanese naval codes in 1941, testified under oath that, as of December 1st that year, recovery of JN 25B had not progressed to the point that it was productive of any appreciable intelligence. The NSA's own classified study of the period, West Wind Clear, found the Stinnett thesis unsupported by the facts. Multiple specific claims in Day of Deceit, misread dates, code wheels that never existed, radio traffic wrongly attributed to Yamamoto's flagship even though it wasn't with the strike force at the time, have all been documented and corrected by scholars, including cryptologist Frederick Parker and historian Philip Jacobson. Among historians who've actually examined the primary cryptologic record, there's no real controversy left about whether Pearl Harbor achieved genuine surprise. It did. The foreknowledge theory survives mostly on its appeal as a conspiracy story, not on the archival evidence. A more defensible version of that critique, one serious historians actually engage with, asks whether American policy in 1941 was designed, intentionally or not, to make war with Japan more likely rather than less. The oil embargo, cutting off 88% of Japan's imported oil in a single move, was about as aggressive as economic policy gets. The Hull Note, delivered November 26, 1941, the same day the Japanese strike force left Hitokappo Bay, demanded Japan pull entirely out of China and Indochina before trade would resume, and Japanese leadership read that as nothing short of an ultimatum. Whether American policymakers understood that combination would make war almost certain and decided the alternative, Japanese control of Southeast Asia, was worse, remains a legitimate question historians still wrestle with. That's a separate question from the foreknowledge conspiracy, and a considerably more interesting one. The second open debate concerns Yamamoto's actual competence as a strategist. One tradition, built largely on Ogawa's biography and the sympathetic film portrayals that followed, paints him as a tragically misused genius who, had anyone actually listened, might have steered Japan toward a less catastrophic outcome. The revisionist counterargument, articulated by Parshall and others, points straight at Midway. The unnecessary complexity, the scattered forces, the decision to sit in the rear where he couldn't actually influence the battle, the failure to anticipate how far American code-breaking had advanced. A fair read holds both things at once. Yamamoto genuinely reshaped naval aviation doctrine and understood American industrial power with a clarity none of his superiors came close to matching. He was also the operational commander whose single biggest battle, Midway, suffered from overconfidence and tactical mistakes his own subordinates had no real way to correct because the command structure he'd built didn't leave room for it. The third disputed point, already covered, is Operation Vengeance itself, specifically whether Barber or Lanfear actually shot Yamamoto's plane down. Current consensus, built on Japanese testimony and physical evidence, favors Barber, though the question may never get a final, airtight answer, since the only other witness who knew exactly what happened was the Japanese pilot flying that bomber, and he went down with it. Back in September 1940, Yamamoto told Prime Minister Kono he could run wild for 6 months to a year. Midway happened in early June 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor and Japan's offensive momentum. The same momentum Yamamoto had been honest enough to put a number on, ran out right on schedule. What came after wasn't a negotiated peace. It was 2.5 more years of a war Japan's own military planners privately knew was unwinnable, at a human cost too large to summarize cleanly. Yamamoto didn't live to see the surrender. He died exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, the same raid that had first revealed how badly his Pearl Harbor strategy had failed to prevent the war he dreaded all along. Nothing in the historical record says the Americans planned that timing on purpose. The date was set by Yamamoto's own inspection schedule, not by any choice on the American side, but the symmetry stands on its own anyway. The man who planned the attack that pulled America into the Pacific War died exactly 12 months after the raid that proved, beyond any doubt, that his plan had failed to keep the war from happening at all. After his death, the combined fleet cycled through commanders, Minaichi Koga and then Somu Toyota, neither one carrying anything close to Yamamoto's authority or institutional weight. The war kept sliding downward. By the summer of 1945, Japan had lost its carrier fleet, lost most of its experienced aircrews, lost its merchant marine to American submarines, and watched its home islands get systematically bombed. The endpoint Yamamoto had described to Kono back in September of 1940 finally arrived in August of 1945. The sleeping giant line Yamamoto never actually said captures, in its tidy Hollywood form, something he expressed more precisely and far more painfully on at least 3 documented occasions, to Kono in 1940, in the Sasakawa letter in 1941, and to Ogata in early 1942. The movie version is a clean, heroic line about prescient wisdom. The real statements are something messier, the words of a man who saw it all coming, said so plainly to the people who could have stopped it, got ignored anyway, and then carried out the very plan he'd opposed because his sense of duty to the institution and the nation left him no other path he was willing to walk. There's no tidy moral conclusion here. Yamamoto wasn't a tragic hero, and he wasn't a simple aggressor either. He was a strategist with rare clarity, trapped inside a system whose logic he could see clearly but never actually control. He read the trap correctly from the start. He helped spring it anyway, and the war that followed unfolded almost exactly the way he'd warned it would. His legacy back in Japan has stayed unsettled ever since, as more than one commentator has put it. The museum in his hometown of Nagaoka doesn't glorify any of it. Retired Japanese Admiral Koji Koda summed up the real dilemma about as well as anyone has. Yamamoto had to choose between leading men into a war he already knew was unwinnable, or stepping back and letting them fight it without their best available commander. Whatever the nation decided, Koda said, that was the duty. The Americans who chose to kill him understood his value in their own way too. Leighton told Nimitz no Japanese admiral came close to matching him, and the same qualities that made Yamamoto the right man to design Pearl Harbor, his grasp of American industrial strength, his belief in carrier aviation as the deciding weapon, his willingness to force hard decisions through institutions that resisted him, made him the single most dangerous Japanese commander in the entire Pacific. The Americans respected him enough to mount an extraordinary operation just to take him off the board. Whether the war would have ended sooner or later with Yamamoto still alive is something nobody can know for certain. What's knowable is simpler than that. In September of 1940, Yamamoto told his own government, in plain language, that he could run wild for 6 months to a year and had no confidence past that point. Japan went to war anyway. The war lasted 4 years and 8 months. Every single month past that first year was a month Yamamoto had already warned them about, in writing, years before the first bomb ever fell. The accuracy of that warning isn't really in question anymore. What's worth sitting with instead is a different question. What does it say about any system, military, political, or otherwise, when the person holding the clearest, most accurate read on the situation is also the one nobody listens to. That question didn't start with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1941, and it didn't end there either. Please remember to remove all headings and also the title heading too. It should directly start from the content of the script.